December 1944. The Ardennes forest lies buried under snow and silence, a silence soon shattered by thunder. German shells scream through the icy air, tearing into American lines. Hitler's last gamble has begun. But within days the storm of war turns against him, not by numbers or tanks, but by science. From the frozen ridges near Monschau to the besieged crossroads of Bastogne, German soldiers begin to die in ways they cannot comprehend. Artillery shells no longer strike the earth. They explode in mid-air, shredding entire formations in seconds. No trench is safe, no foxhole deep enough. Death seems to hang in the sky itself. The weapon behind it remains secret, guarded tighter than the atomic bomb. A fuse that thinks, a radar brain the size of a coffee can, able to sense its target and detonate at the perfect height. In the bitter winter of the Bulge, this hidden American invention would rewrite the rules of war and crush the last great army Hitler ever sent. December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge erupts across the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. It is Hitler's final gamble. Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces surge forward under the cover of fog and secrecy. It is the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. A desperate attempt to split the Allied armies and seize the port of Antwerp. For weeks, American intelligence had been blind. The Ardennes sector was considered quiet, a place for exhausted divisions to rest, regroup, and train replacements. Units like the 99th Infantry, the 106th Division, and the 38th Cavalry Squadron held thin lines in the freezing woods, unaware that behind those trees waited one of the most powerful armored thrusts of the war. At 05:30 a.m., the stillness breaks. The German guns open fire, spitting flame through the mist. 1,600 shells a minute scream across an 80-mile front. In a matter of seconds, the snow is turned to mud and blood. The Americans are caught completely off guard. Communications collapse, positions vanish, and whole battalions disappear into the smoke. Among those under attack is the 38th Cavalry Squadron, a reconnaissance unit stationed near the small German town of Monschau. They face the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, veterans hardened on the Eastern Front. To them, this offensive feels familiar. Overwhelming firepower, fog, and shock tactics. But what they will experience next is unlike anything they have ever seen. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, commanding the 406th Artillery Group in support of the 38th Cavalry, watches his lines buckle. His guns, with standard 105mm and 105mm howitzers, are firing constantly, but it's not enough. German infantry keep advancing through the smoke, their formations tightening as they move. The situation is desperate, then Axelson makes a choice that will change warfare forever. He orders his gunners to load a type of ammunition that no one on that front was supposed to use, shells, equipped with a secret device known only to a few in the U.S. Army's highest circles, the proximity fuse. Its existence had been one of the most tightly guarded secrets of the Allied war effort, restricted even from field commanders. Designed by American scientists at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory under Dr. Merle Tuve, it contained miniature radar sensors that could detect how close a shell was to its target and detonate automatically at the perfect height. Axelson had no permission to use them. The War Department had explicitly forbidden their deployment in Europe's ground fighting, fearing that unexploded examples might fall into German hands. The fuses were authorized only for naval and anti-aircraft guns, where they were already transforming battles against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. But in the frozen woods of the Ardennes, orders mattered less than survival. The Germans were breaking through. Axelson gave the command, "Fire the VT rounds." The first shells screamed into the morning sky, and the world changed. They didn't explode on impact. They detonated in the air, 30 to 50 feet above the heads of the advancing Volksgrenadiers. Each burst rained down thousands of steel fragments in a lethal cone of destruction. Soldiers who had spent years learning to survive artillery fire, by diving into ditches, foxholes, or behind trees, suddenly found no safety at all. The fragments came from above. Trenches filled with men were shredded in seconds. What the Germans couldn't see was the invisible science guiding those shells. Inside each fuse was a tiny radio transmitter, operating on wavelengths between 180 and 220 megahertz. As the shell flew, it sent out continuous radio waves that bounced off the ground, trees, and soldiers below. When the reflected signal reached a specific strength, indicating that the shell was at the ideal altitude, an electronic switch triggered detonation, precise, automatic, unstoppable. The effect was beyond comprehension. German officers reported entire assault companies vanishing in single barrages. Soldiers who had faced Soviet artillery at Kursk or Leningrad now faced something they described as artillery with eyes. Colonel Axelson had violated standing orders, and he knew the risk: court-martial, disgrace, or worse. But in that moment, his decision saved hundreds of American lives. The German assault on Munchau collapsed. Survivors later said the explosion seemed to follow them, bursting just overhead no matter where they ran. The air itself had become the enemy. News of the results reached higher headquarters within hours. By December 19th, General Eisenhower personally requested the release of proximity fuses for general use in the Ardennes. On December 21st, authorization came through. The secret was out. Within days, supply convoys were rushing the new shells to every artillery unit in the Bulge. The 406th 3rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, part of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, received their first batch just as German forces closed the ring around the town. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, got theirs soon after. Even the segregated 969th Field Artillery Battalion, manned by African-American troops under Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, would employ them with deadly precision on Bastogne's southern flank. Everywhere the new fuse appeared, the pattern repeated. German infantry advancing through open snowfields were cut down by invisible bursts from above. Forest positions that once offered cover became traps as tree branches shattered into deadly splinters. Foxholes that had saved lives since World War I became tombs. By the last week of December, German morale was cracking. Prisoners reported that men refused to attack in daylight. Some claimed the Americans had developed a magic shell that could see through clouds. Behind the scenes, scientists and engineers in the United States were already celebrating what had once seemed impossible. In 1940, the idea of placing a functional radar set inside a 5-inch shell was considered fantasy. The acceleration of firing, more than 20,000 times the force of gravity, crushed ordinary electronics. Yet American engineers redesigned every component from scratch. Vacuum tubes once the size of a fist were miniaturized to the size of a pencil eraser by Dr. James Van Allen. To survive launch forces, glass ampoules filled with electrolyte were designed to break at firing, activating tiny internal batteries. By late 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses a day. More than 100 companies, RCA, General Electric, Sylvania, Crosley, had joined the secret program. Each fuse carried a serial number for tracking. Each component was tested individually. Workers couldn't even be told what they were building. The Proximity Fuse project had already cost over $1 billion, second only to the Manhattan Project. And now at last it was paying off in blood and victory. As snow fell over the shattered forests of the Ardennes, Colonel Axelson's unauthorized decision had unleashed something more than a new weapon. It was the dawn of a new kind of warfare, where electronics, not just explosives, decided life and death. The Germans, who once ruled the battlefield through mechanical precision, now found themselves undone by invisible pulses of American science. The technology they had dismissed as impossible was annihilating their best troops. The air bursts over Munchau were more than explosions. They were the sound of a century turning. The shock waves from Colonel Axelson's unauthorized decision spread faster than the shells themselves. Within 48 hours, the entire command structure of the First Army was buzzing with reports. Frontline units were claiming impossible kill ratios. German infantry formations, often 2 or 3 battalions strong, were being stopped cold by a handful of guns firing proximity-fused rounds. To Eisenhower's staff, it seemed almost unbelievable. For weeks, the Allies had been reeling from the German surprise attack. American lines were stretched thin, fuel depots were overrun, and critical crossroads were falling one by one. The new weapon offered something they desperately lacked: time. When Supreme Headquarters authorized its general use on December 21st, the logistical machine of the U.S. Army sprang to life. Convoys carried the coated crates marked VT for variable time through the snow-choked roads of Belgium and Luxembourg. Within days, thousands of shells were distributed across the front. Each artillery crew received precise instructions. The secret of the fuse was to be guarded at all costs. If any round failed to detonate, retrieval parties were ordered to destroy it on the spot. Nothing could fall into German hands. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division faced annihilation. Surrounded by superior forces, cut off from supply and pounded by artillery, they clung to the frozen perimeter with dwindling ammunition. When the 406th 3rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion received its first supply of proximity-fused shells, the effect was immediate. The Germans attacked across open snowfields, believing the weather and tree cover would protect them. Instead, shells exploded 30 feet above their heads. The air turned to steel and smoke. Entire platoons vanished. German officers who had survived years on the Eastern Front described the barrages as unlike anything they had ever endured. Between December 19th and December 31st, the 406th 3rd fired nearly 7,700 rounds. Not all were proximity fused, but enough were to leave a devastating impression. The attack that followed General McAuliffe's famous Nuts reply on December 22nd was shattered by airbursts that tore through the attacking infantry before they could even reach American lines. To the south, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an all-African-American unit under Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, formed part of Bastogne's outer ring. Their 155 Miller howitzers, firing proximity-fused rounds, created what survivors later called a wall of death. The massive shells detonated 50 feet above the snow, covering wide areas with lethal fragments. German soldiers fled before the first wave of explosions had even ended. American observers quickly realized something extraordinary. The new fuses made their guns more accurate without needing to be accurate at all. The radar inside each shell compensated for misjudged ranges and elevation. Even poorly aimed rounds detonated at the optimal height, showering entire areas with fragments. In artillery terms, it was revolutionary. Instead of requiring dozens of adjusting shots, a single barrage could now achieve the same result. It made every gun deadlier, every battery more efficient, and every forward observer's life safer. By Christmas Day, the impact was measurable across the front. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, German units had once found protection under the thick canopy. Now that canopy turned against them. When proximity fuses detonated above the treetops, the explosions shattered branches, turning them into deadly splinters that cut down anyone below. Forest fighting, long considered a defensive advantage, became a death trap. The combination of shrapnel and flying wood fragments created a 360-degree kill zone. Foxholes and dugouts that once guaranteed safety became irrelevant. The Germans began calling the American artillery ghost fire, invisible, unpredictable, unstoppable. At the Sauer River near Echternach, the true horror of the new weapon was documented in detail. On the night of December 25th, a German battalion attempted to cross the half-frozen river under cover of fog. General George S. Patton's Third Army, advancing north to relieve Bastogne, caught them in the act. Patton's gunners fired proximity-fused shells into the darkness. The results were catastrophic. When the firing stopped, over 700 bodies were counted. A single battalion wiped out in minutes. Patton himself recorded the event in his memoir, War as I Knew It. The new posit ammunition was devastating. The shells burst in the air above them. They had nowhere to run. When the firing stopped, we counted 702 bodies. Patton immediately understood what he had witnessed. He ordered his artillery commanders to integrate proximity-fused rounds into every engagement. Within days, Brigadier General Edward Williams developed new tactics designed specifically for the weapon, including time-on-target concentrations, where multiple artillery battalions coordinated to make every shell arrive simultaneously. When dozens of proximity-fused rounds exploded together in the same airspace, the effect was apocalyptic. To the men on the ground, it felt as if the sky itself had detonated. Across the northern front at Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions faced repeated assaults from the 6th SS Panzer Army, Hitler's elite formation led by the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. For 3 days, from December 17th to 19th, American artillery poured out 160,000 rounds. A quarter of those shells were proximity fused, but they accounted for more than half of the German casualties. Over 5,000 men lost in that sector alone. When the smoke cleared, the slopes below Elsenborn were littered with twisted metal and frozen bodies. German units that had once prided themselves on iron discipline simply broke apart. Some soldiers refused to attack. Others surrendered en masse. Even the Waffen-SS, notorious for fighting to the last man, found themselves paralyzed by fear of the unseen weapon. The psychological toll was immense. The Luftwaffe, desperate to regain control, launched Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945. A massive strike by nearly 900 aircraft against Allied airfields. The attack achieved surprise, but as the German planes turned for home, they flew into walls of anti-aircraft fire powered by proximity fuses. Of the 277 aircraft lost that day, 172 were destroyed by flak, most of them detonated by proximity-fused shells. It was the Luftwaffe's last great effort. It never recovered. Meanwhile, at home, the scientists who had made it possible worked in silence. Dr. Merle Tuve and his team at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory had spent years perfecting the fuse in secrecy. Their laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland, was disguised as an abandoned car dealership. Security was so tight that even family members of employees didn't know what they were building. At the height of production, the project employed 3% of all American physicists. By late 1944, the U.S. was producing 40,000 fuses a day. Over 100 companies had joined the effort. Crosley Corporation converted refrigerator assembly lines to fuse production. Sylvania and RCA built the miniature tubes. General Electric handled precision calibration. Each component was inspected under magnification. Every completed fuse was tested under the same G-forces it would experience in combat. Quality control was ruthless, and the result was reliability rates exceeding 80% in live fire. The cost of this effort reached staggering heights, $1 billion in 1940s currency, second only to the atomic bomb project. But unlike the bomb, which would be used only twice, proximity fuses would fire millions of times, shaping the outcome of battles across 2 continents. To the soldiers on the ground, the cost didn't matter. What mattered was survival. Men who had once dreaded German 88s now trusted their own artillery implicitly. Fire missions once called in with hesitation were now executed with confidence. They never missed, one infantryman later said. They always knew where to find the enemy, even when we didn't. By the time Patton's columns broke through to Bastogne at the end of December, the transformation was complete. The Germans still fought fiercely, but they were bleeding faster than they could move. The proximity fuse had turned every American gun into a weapon of precision and terror. Across the Ardennes, from the frozen town of Monchaux to the battered streets of Bastogne, a new reality had emerged. Industrial science now dictated the rhythm of battle. The war that had begun with blitzkrieg, tanks, dive bombers, and shock tactics was ending under the cold logic of electronics. The skies no longer belonged to aircraft alone. They had become the new killing ground of proximity fuses, tiny radar brains rewriting the laws of artillery. And though few soldiers knew it then, the device they had just unleashed would echo far beyond the Ardennes. It was not just a weapon. It was a prototype for the future, for every guided missile, every smart bomb, every precision weapon that would follow. The snow of 1944 concealed many things: fear, courage, exhaustion. But beneath it all lay the beginning of a new era, the age of intelligent warfare. The Battle of the Bulge is remembered as a contest of courage and endurance. Soldiers freezing in their foxholes, tanks grinding through snow, and entire towns reduced to rubble. But beneath that story of mud and frost ran a quieter struggle. One fought with circuits, radio waves, and the invisible mathematics of science. In the frozen forests of Belgium, the laws of war themselves were changing. At the center of it all was a weapon no larger than a coffee can: the proximity fuse. Inside that small metal casing, America had hidden one of the most sophisticated devices ever made. It could sense its surroundings, decide when to explode, and kill with unearthly precision. Its creation had begun years earlier, long before the first shells rained down on the Ardennes. In 1939, radar was still experimental, fragile, and uncertain. A handful of American physicists, led by Dr. Merle Tuve of Johns Hopkins University, believed it could be made smaller, faster, and deadly. Tuve's idea was radical. What if a shell could detect its target and detonate itself at the perfect instant? It would require a radar transmitter inside the shell, able to measure distance in mid-flight, a kind of mechanical intelligence that didn't yet exist. Most dismissed the idea as impossible. Artillery shells endure 20,000 times the force of gravity when fired. No electronic device could survive that. Vacuum tubes would shatter, wires would twist apart, and batteries would fail. But Tuve refused to abandon it. In 1940, he gathered a secret team under the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the same body that would later oversee the atomic bomb. They worked in complete secrecy, out of a disguised laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland, hidden behind the facade of a used car dealership. The men and women inside called themselves the Phooey Gang, mocking those who said it couldn't be done. Their work combined desperation and genius. They rebuilt vacuum tubes from scratch, shrinking them to the size of a pencil eraser, and wrapped them in cushions of wax and rubber to absorb shock. They designed a glass ampule inside each shell that would shatter under acceleration, mixing chemicals to form a tiny battery. When fired, the shell's spin powered a miniature radar that pulsed 200 million times per second, measuring its distance from the ground or its target. If the reflected signal was strong enough, the fuse detonated. It was a weapon that sensed the world around it, a technological miracle built from glass, copper, and courage. By 1942, prototypes worked. But mass production was a nightmare. Each fuse contained over 100 separate parts that had to be handmade, inspected, and assembled under magnification. One grain of dust could ruin it. Factories at Crosley Corporation, RCA, Sylvania, and General Electric were converted into secret assembly lines. The workers, mostly women, had no idea what they were building. They only knew it was vital. By late 1943, the weapon reached the Pacific. The U.S. Navy tested it aboard ships in the Solomon Islands. The results were staggering. Japanese bombers that once required hundreds of shells to destroy were now being cut down by a handful of shots. Success rates in anti-aircraft engagements jumped from 17% to nearly 80%. Admirals were stunned. The proximity fuse had turned blind flak into intelligent fire, but the order was absolute. None of these shells were to be used where they could be recovered by the enemy. If one failed to detonate, it had to be destroyed immediately. The secret was too valuable to risk. For more than a year, the weapon remained confined to naval and anti-aircraft use. Europe's ground forces were forbidden to touch it. That rule held until December 1944, until the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes turned red with blood. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group faced the impossible near Monschau. His men were outnumbered, his ammunition was running low, and the 38th Cavalry Squadron was collapsing under pressure from the 326th Volksgrenadier Division. The German offensive was breaking through. Conventional shells were useless against soldiers advancing through the fog. Axelson knew he had one last option. He broke the rules. He ordered his gunners to load the secret shells, the proximity fuses, without permission from higher command. No one else on that front had dared. But as the first rounds arced through the pale winter sky, the air itself began to change. They didn't explode on impact. They burst in midair 30 to 50 feet above the ground. The effect was apocalyptic. German formations advancing through the trees suddenly disintegrated under invisible fire. Men who had survived years on the Eastern Front, who had learned how to time the rhythm of artillery and when to take cover, found themselves slaughtered where they hid. No trench was deep enough. No foxhole was safe. Axelson's decision stopped the German assault in its tracks. Survivors described shells that seemed to know where they were. Some thought the Americans had developed heat-seeking weapons. Others believed it was divine punishment. In truth, it was physics, cold, mechanical, and precise. Within days, word spread through the American command. General Eisenhower himself heard reports of a new shell that explodes above the enemy. On December 19th, he formally requested permission to use the fuse throughout the Ardennes. 2 days later, the restriction was lifted. For the first time, proximity fuses were authorized for full ground combat. The transformation was immediate. Crates of the new ammunition arrived under armed guard, marked only with 2 letters, VT, short for variable time. At Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was surrounded, the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion began firing them into the fog. At the same time, the 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, with their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, received their supply. Even the segregated 969th Field Artillery Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, would use them to deadly effect on the southern approaches. Wherever they were fired, the results were the same. German infantry walking through open snowfields were erased before they reached American lines. Tanks lost their supporting troops. Assault formations melted under the invisible airbursts. Prisoners captured later said they stopped advancing because the sky was full of fire. Forest fighting, once the German army's greatest advantage, became suicide. The proximity fuse detonations shattered branches, sending jagged wooden splinters flying in all directions. Trees themselves became weapons. A single shell could clear an area the size of a tennis court. Veteran soldiers called it death from the clouds. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers no longer felt safe, even when no planes were overhead. The very air seemed haunted. Officers reported units refusing to move under clear skies, fearing invisible American artillery would sense them. Behind the front lines, the secret continued to spread, not through rumor but through success. Generals began adapting tactics around the new weapon. Fire missions that once required precise observation were now executed blindly. Gunners no longer needed to see their targets. The shells would find their own. In a matter of days, American artillery changed from a support arm into a decisive offensive force. Colonel Axelson's defiance had triggered more than just an order. It had unleashed a revolution, one that the Germans neither understood nor could counter. To them, the Ardennes had always been a place of advantage: thick forests, narrow roads, and winter camouflage. But now even the forest turned against them. Proximity fuses made concealment meaningless. What had been Hitler's last chance to divide the Allies became a battlefield laboratory for a weapon born in secrecy and perfected in desperation. By the end of December 1944, German soldiers feared the sound of American artillery more than tanks or aircraft. They called it the intelligent shell. Some believed it was controlled by radio from Allied planes. Others swore it responded to movement or heat. In truth, it was something far simpler and far more terrifying, a machine that needed no orders at all. The airbursts over Monschau and Bastogne were not just explosions. They were the arrival of a new kind of warfare, where machines could think, measure, and kill without human touch. In the frozen stillness of the Ardennes, the world's first intelligent weapon had been unleashed. By late December 1944, the Ardennes had become a laboratory of destruction. What began as Hitler's desperate counteroffensive was turning into a proving ground for America's most secret weapon. Across the snowbound ridges, proximity fuses were rewriting the rules of war, one artillery barrage at a time. The first reports from the front shocked even their creators. Entire German battalions were vanishing from the map in minutes. American observers who had watched years of fighting in North Africa and Normandy described something entirely new. The air itself seemed to explode. The sky became the battlefield. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than around Bastogne. The town sat at the crossroads of 7 key highways in southern Belgium, the heart of the German advance. For Hitler, capturing Bastogne meant cutting the Allied front in two. For the Americans, holding it meant survival. By Christmas week, the 101st Airborne Division was completely surrounded. Their supplies were nearly gone, their wounded freezing in the cellars of ruined houses, yet the artillery still spoke. The 406th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, armed with 75mm pack howitzers, began using proximity fuses to defend the perimeter. From dawn until nightfall, their guns sent shells into the woods where German units were massing. Each burst ignited above the treetops, filling the forest with steel and shattered wood. German survivors said it was as if the trees themselves had turned against them. Men were torn apart not just by metal but by thousands of splinters hurled at bullet speed. Veterans who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front admitted they had never seen anything like it. They called it ghost fire. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers began refusing to advance under artillery zones, claiming the shells followed them. Entire units lost cohesion. Officers reported panic, hallucinations, even desertions. In the snow and silence of the Ardennes, morale cracked faster than ice. General Anthony McAuliffe's defense of Bastogne became a symbol of American defiance. When German emissaries demanded his surrender on December 22nd, his famous one-word reply, "Nuts," became legend. Yet behind that defiance lay more than courage. It lay technology. The proximity fuse made Bastogne defensible. Without it, no amount of bravery could have held the line. A few miles to the south, Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes and his all-African-American 969th Field Artillery Battalion played an equally vital role. Their 155mm guns, firing proximity-fused shells, covered the approaches from the southwest. The enormous blasts detonated 50 feet above the snow, each one scattering fragments over 100 yards wide. They created a literal ring of fire around Bastogne. German attacks broke against it like waves against stone. The irony was bitter. The men of the 969th fought in segregated units, denied equal treatment even as they changed the course of battle. They fought two wars at once, one against Hitler's army and one against prejudice at home. Yet in December 1944, they proved beyond doubt that courage and skill knew no color. Beyond Bastogne, the story repeated itself. At the Sauer River near Echternach, General Patton's Third Army intercepted a German crossing attempt under cover of night and fog. The Americans couldn't see the enemy, but they didn't have to. The fuses did the work for them. Shells detonated perfectly above the riverbank. When the firing stopped, over 700 German soldiers lay dead or dying. One of the most one-sided artillery massacres in military history. Patton wrote about it himself in his journal. "We caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer. The new ammunition was devastating. They had nowhere to run." It was raw, unfiltered truth from a man who measured everything by results. He understood immediately that the weapon had changed the nature of ground warfare. In his words, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." From that moment, Patton turned his entire artillery command into a precision machine. Brigadier General Edward Williams, his artillery chief, began experimenting with a new tactic called time on target. Instead of staggered fire, multiple artillery battalions would coordinate their firing times so that all shells, hundreds at once, arrived over the same coordinates simultaneously. When combined with proximity fuses, the effect was apocalyptic. Imagine dozens of 105mm and 155mm shells bursting in mid-air at the same instant, each throwing thousands of fragments in every direction. The result was a storm of metal so intense that entire German companies vanished before the first survivors could even fall to the ground. German radio intercepts described panic, confusion, and disbelief. Officers reported men dropping their weapons and running into the snow. One report simply read, "Enemy artillery has become supernatural." At Elsenborn Ridge, the slaughter reached industrial scale. There, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions faced the elite 6th SS Panzer Army, the spearhead of Hitler's offensive. Over 3 days, American artillery fired 160,000 rounds. Only a quarter of them used proximity fuses, but those accounted for more than half of all casualties inflicted. Over 5,000 German soldiers fell in that narrow sector. Entire companies were wiped out in minutes. The Waffen-SS, trained to fight to the last man, began retreating in disorder. Their commanders reported soldiers paralyzed with fear at the sound of incoming shells. Even tank crews refused to advance without infantry support, and the infantry refused to move at all. For the Germans, the Ardennes was turning into a nightmare of science. They had entered the campaign confident, equipped with tanks, machine guns, and experience, but their understanding of warfare, built on precision, discipline, and control, meant nothing against a weapon that seemed to think for itself. Their intelligence officers eventually captured several proximity-fused shells intact during raids on Allied depots. The devices were sent to Berlin for analysis. German scientists studied the circuits, the miniature tubes, the antenna coils. Their verdict stunned them. Impossible. They simply refused to believe that such delicate electronics could survive the shock of firing. Some concluded that the Americans had used decoys to hide the real mechanism. Others thought it was magnetic or heat-based. None of them guessed the truth, that the Allies had solved a problem German engineers had abandoned years earlier. Ironically, Germany had once led in this field. Before the war, firms like Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG in Berlin had experimented with their own proximity fuse designs. By 1940, they had working prototypes using electrostatic sensors, but Hitler, impatient for immediate results, canceled all research projects that couldn't be mass-produced within 6 months. The program was shelved, and with it went Germany's chance to build the very weapon that was now destroying its armies. By late December, even Hitler's generals recognized what they were facing. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt described American artillery as the terror of our soldiers. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army, said bluntly, "They had shells that exploded in the air. It broke our attacks and our morale alike." For the Americans, the new technology came with its own cost. Proximity fuses were complex and expensive. Each one cost as much as a small automobile. But the results justified everything. Each shell that worked could save dozens of American lives. For soldiers freezing in foxholes, that was all that mattered. Behind the front, the factories of America were operating at full throttle. Crosley and Emerson abandoned home appliances to produce fuses. RCA built radar components. Sylvania manufactured the tiny vacuum tubes. At the peak of production, the United States produced one proximity fuse every 2 seconds. More than 22 million were built before the war's end. The human cost of that effort was hidden from the headlines. Workers suffered chemical burns from the compounds used to seal components, exhaustion from 12-hour shifts, and nervous breakdowns from the pressure of perfection. They were told nothing about what they were building, only that the war depended on it. Some would never know that the devices they soldered in silence changed the outcome of Europe's largest battle. As the new year approached, the scale of German defeat became undeniable. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a desperate attempt to destroy Allied air power on the ground. It was their last major air offensive. Nearly 900 aircraft took off that morning. Many achieved surprise. Allied planes burned on their runways. But when the Germans turned to retreat, they met anti-aircraft batteries armed with proximity fuses. In a single day, 277 German planes were destroyed. Most never made it home. The Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. By mid-January, Hitler's grand offensive had collapsed. The bulge in the Allied line was shrinking fast. German divisions that had begun the attack with confidence now withdrew in chaos, leaving their dead in the snow. The proximity fuse had not fought alone. American courage, Allied coordination, and sheer endurance had made victory possible. But without that hidden invention, the outcome might have been very different. In the smoking forests of the Ardennes, the last illusions of German invincibility were buried under steel and snow. The age of the mechanical army had ended. The age of the electronic weapon had begun. The new year dawned over a battlefield that looked less like Europe and more like the face of the moon, cratered, silent, and scorched by weeks of fire. In the forests of the Ardennes, the once proud German divisions were unraveling. The offensive that had begun with thunder now crawled forward through smoke and ruin. By January 1945, the Americans had turned defense into dominance. The secret that began as one colonel's disobedience had become a front-wide transformation. The proximity fuse was no longer an experiment. It was the difference between survival and extinction. The story of that turning point can be traced through 3 battlefields: Bastogne, Elsenborn Ridge, and the Sauer River. Each showed how the new technology didn't just win engagements, it rewrote the logic of war itself. At Bastogne, the siege had entered its 3rd brutal week. The 101st Airborne Division was holding out under constant shelling, its defenders freezing and hungry. General McAuliffe's famous "nuts" reply had already passed into legend, but the reality was grim. Ammunition was running low, artillery units rationed every shell, yet each proximity-fused round fired from the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion carried the force of a dozen conventional shells. The Germans assaulted, again on December 25th, Christmas Day. Fog cloaked the snowfields outside the town. From the tree line, hundreds of infantry advanced in tight formations, supported by half-tracks and tanks. The American guns opened up, the air filling with the eerie sound of shells slicing through mist. But instead of explosions on the ground, there were sudden flashes in the air, rows of detonations hanging above the Germans like falling stars. In seconds, the battlefield vanished into a curtain of smoke and steel. Men were shredded before they could even reach cover. The airbursts detonated precisely over their heads, raining metal at lethal angles. The attack disintegrated. Prisoners captured afterward were stunned. One sergeant told his interrogators, "Your shells waited for us." They were alive. On Bastogne's southern flank, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion joined in. Their 155mm guns fired shells that burst 50 feet above the snow, each one clearing entire fields of life. These men, mostly black Americans who had trained under segregation, now held one of the most critical lines in Europe. The irony was painful. They fought for a freedom not yet fully theirs, wielding technology years ahead of its time. But when the firing stopped, the result was undeniable. Bastogne held. A few days later, to the north, another drama was unfolding at Elsenborn Ridge. Here, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions stood between the Germans and the key road networks leading to Liège. Facing them were the best the Third Reich could still muster, the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. For 3 days, the Germans hurled everything they had at the ridge. Tank assaults, infantry waves, and artillery barrages pounded the American positions. Yet every time they attacked, American guns replied with eerie precision. Proximity-fused shells filled the forest canopy, bursting above the treetops in perfect synchronization. Veterans later said it sounded like 1,000 thunderclaps. The air seemed alive with invisible blades. German formations simply dissolved under the fire. Entire companies disappeared in minutes. One forward observer from the 99th Division wrote, "They came up the slope and then they were gone." It was as if the forest itself exploded. By the time the battle ended, more than 5,000 German soldiers lay dead or wounded below the ridge. Out of 160,000 American shells fired there, only a quarter used proximity fuses. But those accounted for over half the casualties. The mathematics of death had changed forever. The decisive factor wasn't range or quantity anymore. It was intelligence. The shell itself had become the weapon's mind. Meanwhile, further south, General George S. Patton's Third Army was driving hard to relieve Bastogne. As his armored columns pushed north through ice and fog, they found the Germans retreating across the Sauer River near Echternach. Patton ordered his artillery to open fire, and once again the invisible science of the proximity fuse turned a skirmish into a slaughter. The Germans believed the fog would hide them. They were wrong. American gunners couldn't see the crossing, but they didn't need to. The radar inside the fuses could sense the exact distance to the frozen surface of the river. Each shell detonated 30 feet above the ice. The explosions echoed through the valley like rolling thunder. When the firing stopped, 700 German soldiers lay dead. A battalion erased in minutes. Patton watched from a command car on the ridge. Later, he recorded it in his journal with brutal clarity. The new ammunition was devastating. They had nowhere to run. Word of the weapon's power spread quickly. Even German prisoners spoke of it in awe and terror. "The Americans have shells that see," one officer said. It wasn't superstition, it was understanding. The old rules of cover and concealment no longer applied. The air itself had become an enemy. In Berlin, fragments of captured fuses arrived at laboratories for study. Technicians examined the strange circuits, the vacuum tubes smaller than a cigarette butt, the coiled antennas. Their conclusion was disbelief. The report sent to the German High Command stated, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates shells at optimal height. Its operation defies our current understanding of field electronics." The irony was tragic. Before the war, German firms like Rheinmetall and AEG had pioneered similar research. In 1940, they even built working prototypes using electrostatic sensors, but Hitler's impatience had doomed the program. When told it would take more than 6 months to perfect, he ordered all long-term development halted. What Germany abandoned out of arrogance, America perfected out of necessity. Now that decision was coming home to haunt them. The technological balance of power had shifted, permanently. By early January 1945, the German army's last offensive was broken. The Bulge was shrinking, its once deep wedge collapsing under relentless fire. Columns of prisoners trudged through the snow, shivering, hollow-eyed and defeated. To many of them, The true enemy had not been the American soldier they never saw, but the invisible intelligence that killed them from above. They had fought a machine that seemed to know them better than they knew themselves. The turning point had come not through glory or heroism, but through the silent work of unseen hands, scientists, engineers, and factory workers thousands of miles away. Their creation had reached the front just in time, and its impact had been absolute. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the Third Reich's last hope was buried beneath snow, steel, and a whisper of radar waves. The first weeks of 1945 found the Ardennes buried beneath snow and silence. The thunder of battle had faded, leaving behind only the echo of artillery that had changed the war itself. What had begun as Hitler's boldest gamble was ending as a collapse. His armies, once advancing in perfect formations through the fog, were now retreating in shattered columns, stalked by a weapon they could neither see nor understand. The proximity fuse had done what no Allied general alone could have accomplished. It had turned the tide of battle in a matter of days. From Bastogne to Elsenborn, from the Sauer River to the northern forests, the German offensive had been dissected by invisible hands of radar-guided fire. But even as the Allies pushed the enemy back, another storm was building in the skies. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched its last great gamble, Operation Bodenplatte. Nearly 900 German fighters and bombers took off from airfields across occupied Europe in a coordinated strike meant to cripple Allied air power. For a few hours the plan worked. Hundreds of Allied planes were destroyed on the ground. Surprise was total. Then the Germans turned for home. As they crossed the front lines, Allied anti-aircraft batteries were waiting, this time armed with proximity fuses. The results were devastating. The shells didn't need to score direct hits. They only needed to pass close. Each burst filled the air with shrapnel and radar-guided precision. Within minutes, the sky became a graveyard of burning aircraft. Of the 277 German planes lost that day, 172 were brought down by anti-aircraft guns. The Luftwaffe never recovered. For all its boldness, Operation Bodenplatte ended as a massacre, the last desperate strike of a dying air force. It was proof that the same invisible science that ruled the forests of the Ardennes now ruled the skies as well. Proximity fuses had turned every anti-aircraft battery into a mathematical instrument of death. By the second week of January, Allied momentum was unstoppable. Patton's tanks broke through to Bastogne, linking up with the exhausted 101st Airborne. Eisenhower's headquarters declared the German offensive contained. The bulge on the map, that jagged protrusion Hitler had driven into the Allied lines, was shrinking day by day. And everywhere it receded, the same weapon led the way. In the final week of fighting, German positions along the Ahr and Sauer rivers came under continuous bombardment. American gunners no longer adjusted for distance or terrain. They didn't need to. The fuses did the thinking. Each shell knew exactly when to explode, and each detonation tore holes in the enemy's will. The technology had achieved what armies rarely could: absolute psychological dominance. The German army was collapsing not only from physical losses but from terror itself. Soldiers refused to move in daylight. They no longer trusted the forests or the fog. "The sky kills us," one captured officer admitted. Behind the lines, American artillerymen began to realize the scale of what they were witnessing. For them, the proximity fuse was not just a weapon. It was a companion, a kind of silent intelligence that made their shots count. Forward observers who once feared missing their marks could now call fire missions with confidence. It was like having 1,000 eyes in the sky, one veteran later said. Meanwhile, in London and Washington, the secrecy surrounding the fuse began to unravel. Too many shells had been fired. Too many soldiers had seen their effects. On January 6th, the U.S. War Department authorized limited public disclosure. Newspapers like the New York Times ran cautious headlines. New type of artillery shell multiplying effectiveness of American guns. The details remained classified. But the world had caught its first glimpse of the invisible revolution shaping the battlefield. In Berlin, intelligence reports reached Hitler's high command far too late. On January 10th, a captured German document summarized it in bleak clarity. The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse detonating shells at optimal height for anti-personnel effect. It has caused severe casualties among our forces in the Ardennes. No effective countermeasures exist. It was an admission of defeat written in the language of science. On the ground, the evidence was everywhere. Burned forests, frozen rivers choked with shattered equipment, entire divisions erased from the order of battle. At Elsenborn, the snow was still blackened by the residue of thousands of airbursts. Along the roads, wrecked panzers stood half-buried in drifts, their crews long dead. The smell of ozone and cordite lingered in the frozen air. By mid-January, German morale had disintegrated completely. Units surrendered in groups, abandoning weapons and vehicles. Hitler's last offensive had cost nearly 100,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. For the Allies, the toll was also heavy, but the outcome was beyond doubt. The German war machine, once unstoppable, had been broken by a combination of courage, logistics, and innovation. When American forces finally reached the original front line on January 25th, the Battle of the Bulge was officially over. What remained was devastation. Entire towns flattened, forests splintered, thousands of bodies buried under snow. But behind that destruction lay the quiet triumph of an idea, one born not on the battlefield, but in a laboratory thousands of miles away. The proximity fuse had done more than win a battle. It had proven that science itself could be a weapon. It was the first step toward a new kind of warfare, one in which human instinct was no longer the only intelligence in combat. Eisenhower later said that if the Germans had possessed proximity fuses, D-Day might have failed. Patton called it the funny fuse that won the war. Their praise was not exaggeration. In those final weeks of 1944 and the first of 1945, a device the size of a coffee can had reshaped modern combat more completely than any tank or plane. Yet behind the statistics and the science lay a more human truth. Each shell that burst in the sky represented the work of unseen hands, scientists who risked failure, engineers who built the impossible, and factory workers who never knew what they were creating. Many of them would never learn that their anonymous labor in small-town America had changed the course of history. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge was more than the last gasp of Nazi power. It was the birth of something new, a world where machines could sense, react, and decide. The cold forest of Belgium became the cradle of the modern battlefield. As German forces retreated eastward, the echoes of their defeat lingered in the air, not in the roar of tanks or the scream of aircraft, but in the quiet hum of radar waves, pulsing from shells that had learned to think. The age of intelligent war had begun. When the guns finally fell silent in late January 1945, the Ardennes was a wasteland of shattered trees and frozen silence. The Battle of the Bulge had ended in defeat for Hitler's armies, a catastrophe that Germany would never recover from. Nearly 100,000 of his soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Tanks that had once symbolized German power now lay burnt out in the snow. The road to the Rhine was open. In the quiet that followed, the American commanders began to grasp what had happened. The turning point had not come from superior numbers or from the weather shifting in their favor. It had come from a decision made in desperation. A colonel breaking orders to use a weapon still cloaked in secrecy. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, who had first unleashed the proximity fuse at Monschau, now faced the consequences of his defiance. He expected a court-martial. Instead, he received a commendation. His gamble had saved thousands of lives and helped halt the greatest German offensive of the Western Front. General Eisenhower called the proximity fuse one of the most decisive innovations of the entire war. In private, he admitted that had the Germans possessed it, D-Day might have been impossible. Patton's praise was even more blunt. To him, it was the funny fuse that won the Battle of the Bulge. In Washington, reports flooded in from the field. Everywhere the new shells were used, results were the same. Higher accuracy, fewer rounds, and devastating effects. The once classified VT fuse was now being integrated into every major artillery program. Production ramped up overnight. By February, over 40,000 fuses were leaving American factories every day. Behind that output stood a vast network of industrial effort few ever saw. Over 100 companies worked in silence. Crosley, RCA, Sylvania, General Electric, Emerson Radio, each building a piece of the secret. Entire assembly lines were converted. Refrigerator plants turned into weapons factories. Radio workers repurposed into ordnance technicians. The workforce was mostly women. They handled the delicate wiring, the soldering of tiny circuits, the assembly of the glass ampules that would become the fuse's heart. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, often without knowing what they were creating. All they were told was that it would help win the war. Many would only learn decades later that their hands had built one of the most important weapons of the 20th century. By war's end, more than 22 million proximity fuses had been produced. They were used not just in artillery, but in anti-aircraft guns, naval shells, and even rockets. The cost, over $1 billion in 1940s money, made it second only to the atomic bomb project. But unlike the bomb, the proximity fuse would be used in nearly every major engagement for the rest of the war. On the battlefields of Europe, its legacy was immediate. The German army, once the most technologically advanced in the world, found itself outmatched by an enemy that had fused science and industry into one machine. Their own scientists examining captured fuses could only marvel. "It is beyond our present capability," one engineer wrote in his report to Berlin. "A perfect marriage of electronics and artillery." The psychological blow was enormous. For years, Germany had led the world in engineering, jet aircraft, rockets, tanks. Yet in the end, it was a small American device built from glass and copper that rendered those machines powerless. The men who fought with it sensed they were part of something extraordinary. American artillery officers spoke of shells that seemed alive, of guns that could think. They were seeing the first glimmer of a future none could fully understand, a world where machines made decisions faster than humans could react. In the snow-covered ruins of the Ardennes, that future had already begun. The snow began to thaw in February 1945, revealing the wreckage left behind. Burned tanks, twisted artillery barrels, and the frozen bodies of soldiers lay scattered through the forests of the Ardennes. The battle that Hitler had promised would split the Allies had instead broken the back of his army. For the survivors, the silence after the storm was heavy. American infantrymen wandered through fields where not a single tree remained standing. The ground was scarred with blackened craters, each one a reminder of the invisible weapon that had filled the sky with death. German prisoners spoke with awe and confusion. "Your shells had minds of their own," one officer told his interrogators. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt admitted later. "Our attacks broke down not because of American courage, though they fought well, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes." General Hasso von Manteuffel, who had commanded the 5th Panzer Army, described it more bluntly. "They exploded above us. It was not natural. It destroyed our spirit." In the weeks that followed, Allied analysts began compiling statistics. 200,000 proximity-fused shells had been fired during the Battle of the Bulge. They accounted for between 15 and 20,000 German casualties, nearly 1/5 of all losses in the campaign. The weapon increased the lethality of artillery by as much as 10 times. No other single technological advance of the war, apart from radar itself, had produced such results. But behind those numbers were human stories, both of suffering and salvation. On the German side, the cost was unimaginable. Many of the dead were young conscripts, boys of 16 and 17, thrown into battle during the Reich's final days. They had no chance to understand what killed them. To them, it was as if the sky itself had turned against them. For American soldiers, the fuse was a miracle, one that meant survival. Men who had fought through North Africa and Normandy swore they had never seen anything like it. "It was as if we had the hand of God on our side," one sergeant wrote home. Yet even they sensed the unease of what it represented, a weapon that no longer needed human judgment to find its mark. Far from the front, the people who had made it possible were also paying a price. In the factories of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, workers labored in secrecy and exhaustion. Accidents were frequent, breakdowns common, but silence was mandatory. They produced perfection at a human cost, never knowing exactly what their creation would do. For many, the truth came only after the war, when photographs of the Ardennes reached the newspapers and veterans spoke of shells that burst in midair. When victory finally came in May 1945, the proximity fuse was recognized as one of the great scientific triumphs of the Allied war effort. Its development had pushed American industry and physics to their limits. The precision required to make it work established new standards for quality control, production design, and electronics, practices that would later build the foundations of post-war technology. The scientists behind it went on to shape the modern world. Dr. James Van Allen, whose miniature vacuum tubes had survived the guns of Europe, would later use the same techniques to design instruments for the first American satellites and discover the Van Allen radiation belts. The radar principles behind the fuse became the basis for guided missiles and modern targeting systems. The world was stepping into a new era, one where weapons could sense, calculate, and decide. The proximity fuse had done more than win a battle. It had introduced intelligence to the art of killing. For Germany, it marked the end of technological dominance. For the United States, it signaled the beginning of a century defined by scientific warfare. And for the world, it was a warning that the same minds capable of creating miracles could also perfect destruction. In the frozen forests of Belgium, that transformation had already taken shape. The war's greatest gamble had ended not with a tank charge or a heroic stand, but with a whisper of radio waves echoing through the winter sky, the sound of a weapon that could think. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945. The snow-covered forests that once hid the German army now lay silent, blanketed with smoke and ruin. Beneath those trees, something far greater than a victory had occurred. A new kind of war had begun. The proximity fuse, born in secrecy, built by hands that never touched the battlefield, had changed everything. It wasn't just an improvement in firepower. It was a shift in the relationship between man, machine, and decision. For the first time, a weapon could sense its world and act on its own. In the years that followed, the lessons of the Ardennes echoed through laboratories and arsenals across the world. The technology of the proximity fuse evolved into the logic of guided missiles, radar-controlled guns, and precision bombs. It was the ancestor of every smart weapon that would follow, the beginning of an era where intelligence could be built into metal. For the soldiers who lived through it, the memory never faded. They remembered the strange beauty of it, shells bursting like fireworks above white forests, the air filled with light and death. They remembered the silence afterward, and the uneasy realization that something fundamental had changed. Science had become the ultimate weapon. In the frozen stillness of 1944, that truth had been written across the sky, not in words, but in explosions that hung for an instant before fading into snow. Colonel Axelson's defiance, Patton's understanding, and the invisible labor of thousands of anonymous workers had together rewritten the mathematics of war. From that winter forward, battles would no longer be decided solely by courage or numbers. They would be decided by knowledge, by whoever could make machines think faster, aim better, and kill more precisely. The Ardennes was not just the last stand of Nazi Germany. It was the first battlefield of the modern age.